Good afternoon, and welcome to the STS-131 International Space Station Science and Technology Briefing. This is a two-part panel briefing starting one right now, 1:10, and the second one will follow with a 5-minute interval in between. Joining us here today is Mark Uran, the Assistant Associate Administrator for Space Station, Clarence Sams, Chief Scientist, ISS Medical Project, Dr. Scott Dolszewski, ISS Investigator, Chairman, Department of Surgery at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, and Nobuyoshi Fujimoto, JAXA's Associate Senior Engineer for Human Space Systems and Utilization. We're going to start with some opening remarks from our panelists and then take questions. Mark?
Thank you, John. We're happy to be here with you this morning. This is a continuing press conference that we started several missions before to help you understand the scope and the applications of the science program that we're going to be pursuing on the space station. I'll meet with you periodically to keep you updated on the perspective from Washington, D.C. As you know, the ISS was extended in the President's budget, which was released back on February 1, so we're now 60 days into the process of looking at the implications of that extension. This forum is our opportunity to offer you insight into the science and technology program as we ramp it up. We're happy to report that just in the first 60 days, we are rapidly expanding the scope of the science and technology that we're going to see on the space station over the next decade. We're positioning this program for a decade of productive activity. We still have to coordinate closely with both the White House and the Congress in the days to come, but as we move through that coordinating period, we'll share with you the progress as we go along. The program is going to be very expansive. I think today what I'd like to help you understand is that there's really three areas that you'll see progress in our future discussions. First and foremost, there are international uses of the station. Those are the uses by our partners in Canada, Europe, Japan, and Russia. Those uses of the station are managed by our partners, funded and budgeted by our partners, and we collaborate closely with them through international forums that have already been established. Then there's, of course, NASA uses of the station. Those are the uses that meet our mission requirements, part of what drove us to build a space station, and they're largely in the areas of biomedical research so that we can extend our human crews further and farther into space, and of course in spacecraft technology development for next generation systems. But then there's a third area that you haven't heard a lot about in the past that I think you'll hear more of in the future, and that are U.S. national uses of the ISS. Within our U.S. share of the resources and accommodations on space station, we've entered into agreements with other government agencies, private firms, and nonprofit organizations to conduct R&D in space, and we expect that those agreements are going to be increasing now that the space station is being extended beyond 2015. So we'll share with you the status of those partnership agreements as we proceed. It may sound a little bit ambitious, but it's important for you to recognize that we've got 46 payload positions on the space station. That is like the equivalent of 7 or 8 space labs flying simultaneously and continuously throughout the year. So this is really a tremendous jump in capability over our history. We'll be able to do research in a much different way than we've done it over the past 25 years. Those 46 positions are divided up about halfway between the internal positions and the external positions, so the opportunities are there both for science and for technology. Now, today's theme is going to be in human physiology and the applications of that, but we also want to add this technology panel so that we can share our enthusiasm for the Sabatier reactor that's going up on this flight. We're making consistent progress with our regenerative environmental control and life support system. That's the system that recycles our water and oxygen. And of course, we're always looking to minimize the water that we need to take to orbit because of the mass penalties associated with it. But we are making consistent progress towards closing the loops in water and oxygen, and the folks will tell you where we are today. The ISS may well be the most advanced system in operation for both energy efficiency and environmental recycling. We have to be because we're 350 kilometers up. You'll also hear about the new NanoRacks partnership that we put in place. What this does is it extends our philosophy of standardizing the interfaces down into the rack level. We previously standardized the interfaces at the laboratory level. We've standardized the racks themselves so that they're interchangeable, and now we're just moving the next logical step into standardizing the interfaces within those racks. And what it does is it enables us to carry on a micro scale or a nanosat equivalent program inside the pressurized volume of the station. So we're very excited about the range of opportunities available, and we will share with you one subset, one theme at a time. So today's theme is human physiology, and with that, let me hand it over to Clarence.
Thank you, Mark. As Mark pointed out, we're moving into the utilization phase of the station, and with that, it has an enormous amount of assets that are contributed by a range of partners. It's a very, very unique facility, and as with all unique facilities, it also has some unique challenges to operate in. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about is if you're a researcher here on the ground, the first question you might ask is, well, I got my science selected, how do I operate here? And how do I translate my science from the laboratory I'm used to working in here on the ground to this unique asset that is on board and operating in a very unique place? And ISSNP, or the International Space Station Medical Project, is a team that whose job it is to try and enhance and optimize the return of the life sciences investigation, the human life sciences investigations during the life of station. And so our role is to be a bridging interface between the research community and the operations community of station. We're the ones that help translate an investigator's experiment from here on the ground into operations and flights, such that we can maximize the output for the investigator and get the most science within the station assets that are available. We serve as the primary point of contact for the research teams, and the types of roles that we serve are to do things. We initially will assess the experiment that was proposed and translate those into implementation requirements, because at NASA we work off implementation requirements. And these will include facilities, hardware, how to fit it into the timeline, and what constraints the experiment has on it, so that what does a crew member have to do, what does the crew member have to not do in order to participate in this experiment. We then work with the PIs to develop training and procedures for that so the crew members can carry this out. And then ultimately we work with the ISS ops teams in order to implement the experiments on board. And these would include things of getting the appropriate human use committee things, crew briefings, crew training, and also ongoing supporting of the on-orbit ops. ISS also maintains a human research facility on board, and so the human assets on board that are in the U.S. allocation and our racks are maintained by ISSNP that are applied to a lot of the human resources. We also interface with all of our partner agencies so that we can broadly share our experimental assets across experiments from each of the partners. So there's a lot of sharing that goes on board with all the assets of the partners, and that enhances the ability that any individual researcher can have and the assets that can be used there. One of the interesting things of doing this is, of course, in this team we end up pretty much interfacing across the board for and representing the research teams to the international partners, our ISS Station Program Office, the crew office to interface with the crews and do their training. We take information that they are learning and feed that back into the requests that our agency is making. It's a very close interaction also with the medical operations guys, because in the human life sciences, everything that you do from an experiment on the humans impacts the guys that are trying to do the crew care on the orbit for the crew members as well. So there's a very dynamic back and forth there that feeds both the research side and feeds the medical operations sides as well. So just as a quick wrap up here, ISSNP really works with the research and ops community to integrate their activity on board, to enable the research to happen in the human life sciences on station. Station is definitely a challenge to do research on. from translating what person is used to here on the ground. But it's a very capable laboratory and has very unique assets. Both these challenges allow both science content and the challenge of actually operating there evolves our technology, and there's benefits to both of them. Dr. Dolchowski will be talking about an area where the implementing ultrasound and other medical diagnostics on board has actually turned around and changed the applications of some of those technologies routinely here on the ground. And both of those are real products from the program as you go through. With that, I'll pass it on to Scott.
Thanks, Clarence. Good afternoon, everybody. It might not seem intuitive how providing care on the International Space Station in a remote village in Africa are similar, but let me share some of that with you, and I'll have you pull up my first slide if you would. Let's think about that village in Africa for just a second. We have a challenge of often not having a physician available. We have limitations in equipment, training challenges, and certainly cost things. Now take a look at this photo. We have the exact same constraints right there, and I might add that we're going to have those same constraints in the U.S. with the recent health care bill enactment, so we better get used to this stuff. Now, my challenge was how to provide medical care to non-physician providers on the International Space Station and do it with what we already had on board. So we currently have an ultrasound machine in the Human Research Facility on station. Many of you know that ultrasound's used when you have a child to diagnose the sex of that child or an abdominal ailment, but our first challenge was to see what we could do with this. And so we went to a large academic medical center, Henry Ford Hospital. It's a large place, level 1 trauma center in downtown Detroit. And we said, what can we use this for? Can we diagnose a collapsed lung, a broken bone, something like that? Now, in my hospital, we would use an X-ray or a CT or an MRI, and we certainly didn't have that on station. And what we found surprised us, that it worked darn well for that. In fact, sometimes even better than what we were doing. So now a terrestrial standard is to utilize ultrasound, and it's based on outreach for these ultrasound techniques. But that was in experts' hands, and we don't have that luxury on the International Space Station. So the next thing we had to do was come up with a very quick training method to get our astronauts and cosmonauts on how to provide this level of care. My project, ADAM, Advanced Diagnostic Ultrasound and Microgravity, allowed us to do just that with the astronaut crews, with just-in-time training and something that we coined remote expert guidance, where an individual on the ground would help the operator talk through doing one of these. And if you'd pull that first slide back up, this shows cosmonaut Gennady Padalka performing a bone ultrasound on Mike Fink in the Human Research Facility on the International Space Station. This is a really difficult technique, and yet they were able to accomplish this in just under an hour of training. This also formed the first publication submitted and accepted from space to the journal Radiology. Next slide, please. Well, there's a lot of underserved areas on the Earth medically, and so we purposely chose one of the harshest ones to trial this technique. This photo shows a Swedish climber performing a chest ultrasound examination on another injured climber on Mount Everest. Now, this is about 21,000 feet up. You can see an ultrasound machine in the center screen, much like the one on the International Space Station. This climber had never seen an ultrasound before, yet alone produced one. This is a solar-powered device. We utilized a satellite phone. You can see my picture using UVU across the World Wide Web to diagnose increased lung fluid in this climber, which often occurs during high-altitude endeavors. Next slide, please. Well, we wanted to bring this back to a more terrestrial environment, and so we started talking to a variety of sporting venues. We initially started out in my hometown, Detroit, with the Detroit Red Wings, and so we utilized ultrasound to diagnose player injuries at the venue. This was very popular. It could get the hockey players back on the rink very quickly. We didn't have a doctor there. We taught athletic trainers how to do this technique. And apparently they talk, because we were then approached by the Olympic Committee. And so we taught athletic trainers, non-physicians, in Chula Vista, in Colorado Springs, in Lake Placid, how to perform these examinations. We performed hundreds of evaluations in the training facilities. And then finally in Torino, Beijing, and most recently in Vancouver. Now, any of you who covered those events know that the downhill course was particularly challenging this year. And we had a number of injuries, one of which was with a noted downhill women's skier. She had a bad fall on a practice run 3 days before her medal event. We did a remote ultrasound guided, much as we would on the International Space Station. We diagnosed an injured leg, but not a limiting leg on her. She was able to run and have a gold medal 3 days later. Next slide. The final slide I have for you brings it really close to home, maternal care. So it's very challenging in many areas on our planet to provide high-quality medical care to women, and particularly those in childbearing years. The challenge of having a child in an underserved village is about 300-fold what it might be here in Florida or in any of your cities across this country. We took our training methods and we modified them a little bit, because certainly when we're going to Mars, I don't have the luxury of telemedicine as we know it now. If I'm a doctor at the Johnson Space Center and I say, wait a minute, stop here, they don't hear that until 20 minutes later, and obviously that's not a good thing to do for medical care. So we took a set of video glasses like this. We took our programs on that, and we did something called autonomous care. So we gave them the capability to do this without talking to us. And that's exactly what they did in this tiny village in the high Arctic Circle. So we had them do very complex exams, some pregnancy scans as shown on that slide, some heart exams and things like that. And they were able, with very high accuracy, to perform these examinations. And I think, in summary, not only have we now improved care capabilities on the space station, but I think we have translatable benefit back here on Earth. We will not always have the luxury of a highly skilled practitioner and highly expensive imagery available. I think we've gotten through that now on station, and this should improve care capabilities here on Earth as well. I have some outreach CDs that have this in greater detail, should you wish those at the end of this conference. Thank you. John.
Would you move?
Thank you. Since 1.5 years have passed, we start operation of the Japanese experiment module called Kibo on board the space station, and we believe now we are fully using the capability of the space station. And this space shuttle 131 flight is very special space shuttle flight for Japan and JAXA. Not only because we have two Japanese astronauts simultaneously on board the space station and do the science with two crew member collaboration, but also we plan a multiple human research type of experiment on board the space station in the short time frame of this STS-131 flight. First slide, please. We are planning 4 different type of human research type of experiment. First one is code name is MyoLab. This experiment will investigate the muscle atrophy induced by the microgravity or unloaded condition. And the next one is NeuroLab. This experiment, slide back please. Okay, the first slide, thank you. The second decal, it's a new rod. This experiment focused on the space radiation effect to the human nerve system. And the third one is Michael. This experiment investigate the microflora dynamics on the crew members. And the last one is radiation monitoring called PADRES. Here we have two PIs. one PI from Tokushima University, Myola PI, Professor Dr. Nikawa. And also, I have another PI from Kagoshima University, a PI of Neurolab, Professor Dr. Majima. So if you have any detailed question, we have a chance to ask them later. Next slide, please. I would like to quickly briefing about this experiment. The Myolab experiment focused on the muscle atrophy. Dr. Nikawa's team are focused on the kind of enzyme or the proteins in the muscle cells. The name is CBLB or CBLB. This is one of key enzyme which will be affect to the muscle atrophy. So we will culture the L6 cells on board the space station and chemically fixed and return back to the Earth and investigate how this enzyme will working during the muscle atrophy. Here, nowadays, many Japanese elder people lie in bed condition or wheelchair condition. This is very serious problem for Japanese society. So we hope this kind of experiment will dedicate not only for the astronaut or spaceflight, but also for human health on the ground. Next slide, please. Another experiment is Neurolab. This experiment focused on the space radiation effect on human cells, especially for the central nervous cells. This experiment also using a cell culture technique. We will culture the human neuron-like cell. Name is SKNSH cells. We will culture this cell line about a month long on board the space station and bring it back to the Earth and investigate using the DNA array or Western blotting or modern gene analysis technique. The objective of this experiment is in the future we need to know how the space radiation affect to the crew members to prepare for much longer time manned space activity. Next slide, please. The other two experiments are running by JAXA ourselves. One is investigate about their crew members' health. We are collecting crew members. We are collecting samples from crew members from nasal cavity or pharynx or skins. These are not so painful for the crew members to collecting these samples. But it is very important to understand these resident microflora, because microflora on the body is essential or a very important role for the human health and human immune system. The last one, we are continuously monitoring the space radiation inside the GEM module. You can see about 16 different points in the GEM pressurized module. We used a small passive dosimeter to continuously monitoring the space radiation inside the GEM. That is all the planning experiment in the short time frame. And the important thing is we are increasing this kind of human research in the Japanese Kibo module for the future human activity in the space station. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll now take questions here at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Remember to wait for the microphone and state your name and affiliation. Questions?
Ken Kramer for Planetary Society and Spaceflight magazine. Let me ask the Japanese colleague. Mark, you mentioned the budget increase that President Obama has announced for the U.S. space program. I'd like to know, you have a new government in Japan. What is their attitude? Has your budget increased? I read some reports they were actually interested in cutting the space program.
Currently, the budget is not increasing but not decreasing. It's flat base. However, new government established kind of board to discussing our future space activity. Still, they are discussing the strategy of Japanese space program, and the discussion is not yet finished. However, maybe you know the Japanese new Prime Minister, Dr. Hatoyama, called Uchujin, that means spaceman. So I hope he will support our space program.
Jay Kloddick, Nebraska Press Association. Question for Dr. Scott Deltrosky. Yes. Very interesting work on the ultrasound system. Is there anything in life sciences involving working on techniques or doing any training of astronauts for any on-orbit emergencies that might involve invasive procedures, those that are not trained in a medical field? And I mean, I've heard of some short-term research taking place on the Vomit Comet, but are there any plans for anything long-term on the ISS?
Yeah, I am but a PI, so I can't speak for NASA. However, being exposed to a variety of experiments along this line, I think I was very surprised when I'm a long-trained surgeon with many years in schooling and then on-the-job apprenticeship. I thought that there was absolutely no way that these crews were going to be able to perform complex procedures that we were going to get them to do. And I must say I was very impressed that we were able not only to have them do that, but then they took the ball and they'd say, "Hey, can we do this? How about this and that?" So it was way more intuitive. And I think we've now extended that to sports folks. I had Brett Hull, who's a defenseman from the Red Wings, doing ultrasound exams on his other partners. So I guess I have to really reevaluate my training. But I think if you wanted to extend that, okay, how about appendicitis? It's something we all have some thoughts about, and I know the Russians have one way of treating that. We may have another one. I think that, and we've all seen what's happened on Antarctica with breast cancer in the past and things like that. And what we're suggesting to do is may not necessarily be what you might get at Henry Ford Hospital should you come in with appendicitis, but it'll probably be good enough to get you through the eye of the needle till you recover or get to another care facility. And I think that that's what we're now working on relative to more complex and invasive procedures. It may not be exactly equivalent in that, but it will be life-sparing and morbidity decreasing on that one. So I wouldn't think it's in our future to fly an operating room or an emergency room or things like that, but it'll be in our future to fly educational tools that will provide some on-site, very quick diagnostics and some moderate therapeutics, which we already have, and expand on that. And then working with some of the smart medical systems, that's really the future, not only in the space program, but and on our planet as well, where you could provide some of that rather than having big fancy doctors all over the place.
John Tierney with the New York Times. For both of the researchers, do you have any general thoughts about what we've learned, either that's encouraging or discouraging about the prospects for going to Mars, about the effects of muscle atrophy on the crew, the effects of radiation, and dealing with emergencies along the way? It's a general question, but.
It's very, at this moment, difficult question because space radiation on the moon or towards the moon is much higher than the ISS orbit. So it must be affected crew health. So we need to investigate and protect crew members from the space radiation if we go to the moon or Mars. So that is an engineering challenge. In order to prepare for that, we would like to continue the experiment on board the space station to to learn about the effect of the space radiation. About the muscle atrophy, I think it's rather positive because we have some countermeasure. One is, of course, the crew exercise, and also on board the space station, we are now investigate to using some kind of medicine to keep the bone or muscle to protect from the atrophy. So that may be overcome in the near future. However, radiation is maybe a much difficult challenge for the future spaceflight.
I think that it's encouraging because sometimes when you're faced with a constraint, you have to be particularly innovative. So if we had no constraints, we could fly a vessel that's got a wall a foot thick of lead, and we wouldn't have to worry about all of these things. We could fly a full gym and everything else, and it could be just like Earth. But we don't have that luxury. So we may not actually have an engineering solution to some of those challenges, but we may have a pharmacologic. So you may take a much bigger radiation hit than we would be comfortable in this room, but we may have some wonderful drug protection against that hit. We've already gotten through many of the constraints relative to the bone loss and relative to muscle and things like that. There are more in that, but I think it's very positive, and I'm assuming Clarence has some thoughts on some of the other things that we've done on some of the countermeasures.
Yes, I'd just like to add a couple of points. I think from a global perspective, when you look at the crew members, you find that human beings are much more adaptable than you necessarily expected them to be, but that almost all the control systems are feedback loops. So they respond to the environment that they're in. And a lot of what we're trying to learn during station is how to balance the fact that you have an adaptive organism that is changing, and how do you keep it within the bounds of where you want. And we have a variety of countermeasures activities that we're doing now, but that, I think, in a large sense, is the overall concept for the human research program. How do you keep people in the bounds of how you keep them healthy and how you keep them able to perform in the way you want them to? Knowing that they're an adaptive system, you've put them in another environment. If you don't do anything, they'll adapt to that environment, which may or may not be the best thing for the organism.
Robert?
Hi, Robert Perlman with CollectSpace.com with a couple of questions. First for Mark. You mentioned that the payload equivalent was for about 6 to 7 space halves, but of course or space labs, of course each of those would have had 6 to 7 crew members. So are you at the limits right now of crew capability to support the many science payloads, or could more be added within the allotable crew time?
Right. Well, the difference, of course, is the Space Lab missions were only 6 to 8 days long. So we've got a near continuous 365-day per year mission with our 6 crew. And we're looking forward to ramping up into that available crew time. The crew currently has the time to support more research than was previously being performed during the assembly phase. So we're looking forward to being able to keep them pretty busy in the future.
Sorry, just to follow up with Scott and Clarence. It was mentioned about training non-doctors to perform medical procedures on orbit, but is there a value of having trained MDs on board the station, and have you been able to take advantage of the MDs that have flown, like Mike Barrett?
Yeah, obviously you can do different training algorithms if you have somebody who's an expert already in that, but please understand that the probability of a medical event during a mission is pretty darn low, and so training is appropriately focused on that probability, where you're going to have to do some other things to maintain the vehicle and other contingencies. I think that those skilled individuals who have been on orbit have been particularly useful because of the feedback they give us. They say, well, I know how to do that. I was trained in that. But if we did it this way in that unique environment, it would work better. So I think they've streamlined. And I must say, we've performed almost 100 hours now of ultrasound on orbit, most of which has been done not with physicians. Dr. Barrett did do some of our ultrasound. At the end of the day, I can't tell the difference between those examinations, and I think part of it is because we talked to him before he went and the other crew members. But the second thing is we had our listening ears on. So when the crew went, you know, this would be really good if you would provide us with this. And so having been able to have that circular feedback to a researcher, which is unusual, I think, for standard research, I think that was the best thing that we did.
I just want to add one or two things to that, and one is you know, looking at some of the ultrasound activities and sort of how they're gone, having people that are experts on orbit really does add that feedback, and the crews will come up with as they're interacting with the research teams, they'll sit there and go, you know, your procedure said to do this, but if we did this, we could get a much cleaner signal, and so they evolve that with the research team as you're going on, and that is another thing that is also very much unique about station science compared to things like space labs and the other types of things we're flown. You know, in a space lab, your time is so constrained with the week that you've got, and you have so much activity, you don't usually have the time for the interface with the crew member, for the feedback between the crew member and the researcher, and let's evolve the experiment as you go on. And so on station, you actually get to use people as your colleagues, and that's all the individuals of the team. And they evolve the science as it goes on. Their observations feed back to the science team, and the science team goes, gee, I wasn't expecting that. Well, let's do this and this and this next time. And so it's very much a communication between the people at the implementation level, the crew members, and the researchers that get to interface with them during an extended time that they're on orbit.
Tark.
Thank you. Tarek Malik with Space.com and Space News. I have, I think, one question and a follow-up. My first one is for either Mr. Urin or Dr. Sams. With the station's extension through at least 2020 now, I'm curious what types of studies you've had at the back of your head, or I guess at the back of your minds. Now maybe you'll get a chance to fly up, and how the station can be a test bed for things, not just for space, but for on the ground. Like I believe there's a filtration system on Discovery flying up that could be used for water purification for IVs, you know, in space or on the ground. If you can kind of go into that a little bit, that would be great. Thanks.
Let me start it off at the general level. A lot of the organizations that we were working with prior to the extension were interested in access to a laboratory for long term. It's difficult to mount a research program if you know your laboratory assets are only going to be available to you for a few more years. Once we did the extension, we think that opens up the scope of organizations that are willing to invest in a research program that now has a lifetime of 10 years or better. It's really opened that scope up immensely, and it's across all of the categories, across biology, chemistry, and physics. But Clarence, you probably have some specific examples.
Yes, we in the human life sciences, there's actually an integrated research plan on the U.S. side that basically has, if you're looking to solve your human health and performance risk for doing exploration class missions, which is one of the major objectives of that program, we have a lot of risks and gaps of knowledge that we need to fill. And we've mapped those out through the life of station. So there is a plan to both solicit specific things from the research communities, specific subjects, at specific times to map them over the asset that we have a station. And yes, it certainly is a big benefit that we can now map that over a 10-year period, because you can burn down a lot more of those risk areas and actually get the opportunity to examine them, have your evidence base, go to countermeasure development and validate that before you get out of the access to the laboratory.
Thank you. Just a short follow-up. There have been maybe a limited number of humans that have been able to fly in space, and the station's a good platform for, I guess, extended studies. And I'm just wondering how significant the number of folks you've had involved in the studies, these astronauts, are, and how many more you might need to really expand the statistical significance of your tests versus maybe medical studies on the ground that have thousands of participants.
When you know, obviously the subject N is always a challenge for all of us from the research side, and you're absolutely right. One of the things that you see in typical clinical studies is, you know, N's of hundreds and thousands and that type of thing. You know, I think one advantage you have in some of the things that you're looking at on space station is here on the ground you tend to be looking at things where it's a very wide population that you're looking at sometimes subtle events in. And for most part, what we're looking at on our station crew members are some relatively major events that turn on like clockwork, like the bone demineralization and such. If you look here on the ground, you have people who do that, people who don't do that, and that type of thing. We have a population of very healthy people. We put them on orbit, and everybody starts losing bone. And so kind of our problem is a little bit different, and to be able to get to an N level that provides a confidence that you understand that problem and also can address it is a different type of problem than you have in some of the clinical assets. And I think we have sort of an adequate plan to get us to an end to solve the majority of those issues.
Yeah.
Scott.
Yeah, I had to go through just that challenge because many of the ultrasound techniques for a collapsed lung, for instance, they had not been done before, and so what we did was had an N of 500 in my large hospital that showed, yeah, it seems to work okay. Then we took that as almost observationally to the National Space Station. I think that's what we will have. We'll never get a large N in space research, except for more basic processes. I was honored enough to sit on the last NIH panel, which was now choosing the next basic science that's going to fly on station. And in all of those experiments, statistical relevance was a strong consideration. So the N's you'll see in more basic things are considerably larger than human research.
Andrew Rennie from Southern FM in Melbourne, Australia. Question to Mark, please. Without the shuttle, will the European Space Agency's ATV and Japan's HTV be sufficient to loft all the experiments to ISS? And a follow-up question, and what about returning materials from the space station? Will you have enough capacity for the completed science?
Yeah, no, those are excellent questions. First, you probably heard the analogy that the shuttle is like a 16-wheeler. It's much more capacity than we would ever need to operate and maintain the space station, conduct the research program over the next decade. So we have this combination of our partner vehicles as well as the contracts that we put in place here in the United States for commercial vehicles that will be providing cargo, resupply, and return services to us over the next decade. Those are going to be demonstrated. The demonstrations begin next year, and over the 2011-2012 period, we'll see these commercial capabilities come on orbit. If those capabilities were delayed, the resources available from our partners are sufficient to operate and maintain the spacecraft and to carry on our mission requirements at NASA. But we would delay a full-up utilization of the station if those cargo resupply services were delayed. But we're confident that within the next 1 to 2 years, we're going to begin seeing those demonstrations. And one of those resupply contractors has a return service.
Right here in the front.
Hi, Ken Kramer for Spaceflight Magazine. Question for Scott. Can you tell us the ultrasound? Have you actually, the astronauts actually diagnosed any injuries, even minor ones at all? And you mentioned the pharmaceuticals as a countermeasure for the radiation. Can you mention a few specific pharmaceuticals you would try?
Let me first do the easier one, the astronauts. Our experiments were not based on injury diagnosis in that. That said, they found some interesting things in each other that the crew confidentiality won't let me get into. I am confident that if they had anything more substantive, they would be able to pick it up since they were virtually performing autonomously by the end of their six-month stints out there. I was talking more theoretically as a molecular biologist about protective mechanisms for radiation. We're not quite there yet, but there are some interesting developments coming down the pike, and I think by the time we're contemplating a long duration mission either back to Moon or to Mars, that we will have some cocktails that will be able to provide some protection.
James Dean, you have a question? Right here, James.
James Dean from Florida Today for Mark. You're talking about a increased interest level from researchers based on shuttle extension, particularly for studies that would take a longer period of time, obviously. Just curious, is there a limit of how long any given experiment can occupy room on the station? And I'll follow up, thanks.
Yeah, and it's on the basis of the station extension, not the shuttle. On the basis of the station extension, it's not so much a single experiment that requires a 10-year period of performance as it is being able to conduct a research program over a 10-year period that allows you to revisit and do the necessary follow-on investigations that get you down to the details necessary to reach your scientific objective. That's not done quickly. Typically, a 10-year horizon is not unusual to develop a new application from a basic research finding. In fact, some of them are as long as 40 years. Will a decade be sufficient? We believe that in a decade, given the capabilities that we have with this vehicle and the emerging transportation systems to service it, that we'll be able to demonstrate enough competitive advantages of this environment that we're not worried at this point about what happens after 2010. We think the evidence we present will drive what happens.
And also, I was just curious in terms of how you're planning out what experiments get to fly when. Is that something, do you look a few missions ahead? Are you looking years out? Are you looking even beyond 2015? How locked in are things now? How fluid is it to decide what flies when?
At the international level with our partners, we have a 5-year planning horizon. We then step back and we have a 2-year planning horizon for the more detailed, or what we call the tactical level of scheduling a package on this flight versus the other flight. It's a pretty detailed planning process because it's highly optimized first across the partnership and then within any single partner's planned research. And the ability to bring in new science at any step in that way is always preserved. I mean, we don't allocate 100% of our available resources. We do announcements and then we re-announce 2 or 3 years later so that we can have the freshest research ideas at any given point in time.
We have time for one more question. Any more? One here in the front.
Yes, you mentioned the Ken Kramer for Spaceflight Magazine. You mentioned the radiation experiment. Can you tell us what you have measured? Has any surprises? Have you found any leaks inside Kibo?
Okay. So we started the radiation monitoring since the Kibo operation 1.5 years ago. Our radiation monitor is usually back to the Earth every half year. And it's a passive dosimeter, so we measure the energy and particular ion energy. And currently, in the past, we expected the solar activity. It's about 11-year cycle. And we expected we will have much more radiation in the past 1 year. However, the result is the solar system is a little bit quiet compared to the expectation. We are a little bit less radiation dose in the past 1 year, but it's not a surprising result because this is observed in the various different astronomy or satellite. So at this moment, we have no surprising surprising result from the radiation dose inside the gem, and we believe that the gem itself performed expected protection of the radiation for crew members, and we can safely running the gem module with astronauts at this moment. And we continue to this measurement as long as we can operate the gem and to compile the data. These data will be available on the website of JAXA website. So I think you can see the radiation measured data in the gem on the website.
Okay, thank you. That's going to conclude the first part of today's science and technology briefing. We're going to take a 5-minute break, so around at 12:05, or excuse me, 2:05 Eastern Time, we'll get started with the part 2, which is commercial partnerships. Hope you'll join us. For all this information you heard and much more on space station science, visit us on the web at nasa.gov/station. Thank you.